Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our webinar today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. We are here to present to you a presentation on DDMRP, Stop Managing Your Supply Chain Chaos. And we are recording today's session, so everyone who's registered with an email will get a link to the on-demand version of a copy of today's presentation within the next few days. This session will run for a total of 60 minutes, which includes the question and answer period. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar console. So we can address them towards the end of the presentation. And if for some reason we don't have time to address all of your questions in today's live event, please be assured that we will follow up with you directly following the webinar. My name is Bill Bruton, and I'm account executive at SHEA Global. I have over 10 years of experience working with clients in various industries and helping to align solutions to some of the most pressing business challenges. The topic for today's webinar should be pretty interesting for anyone attending and looking for ideas on how to improve your supply chain responsiveness. It is a little bit of a different concept. It is quite fascinating to go through. I'm certain you'll enjoy the presentation today. I'll be the host for the webinar, and as part of my hosting duties, I'll quickly introduce you to our company and presenters. A little bit about SHEA. SHEA, we challenge customers to look beyond the status quo to make their business better. We believe businesses have the potential for business excellence, and we're very passionate throughout our organization on helping guide our customers to achieving the highest potential in their companies. We're an essential service according to the province of Ontario. We will continue to stay open to service our clients during this COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. We are a global provider of ERP, CRM, business intelligence, and of course the demand-driven technologies that will would align to some of the conversations that we're having today. SHEA Global supports organizations in 25 countries and from offices in Canada, US, the UK, India, and the Philippines. Our team consists of many experts with a lot of experience helping clients in many different industries. While most of our projects center around manufacturing and wholesale distribution spaces, we also focus in areas like aerospace and defense, automotive, consumer goods, electronics, fashion, food and beverage, machinery and equipment, medical devices, chemical, plastics and rubber, and pharmaceuticals. Without further ado, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker today, John Malby. John is a regional president of an Apex chapter and also teaches through the body of knowledge. He also has an extensive supply chain background, very experienced, and like most people with that amount of experience, probably comes with a lot of scar tissue too. John is a master demand-driven instructor and has been teaching the topic since 2017. John is endorsed to teach the demand-driven leader class as well as the demand-driven SNOP and the DD Bricks program as well. So welcome, John, and thank you for sharing your insight today. And on that, I'm going to hand over the floor to you, John.
Thank you very much, Bill, and hello, everyone. About a year and a half ago, I was able to start my own company called Become Demand Driven. And since then, I've been spreading the word about demand-driven MRP and the wide range of advantages to embracing demand-driven MRP in your business, and helping people to stop managing chaos and start driving progress. Today, we're going to talk about flow and how flow changes how you think about your business and how it's already a part of what we do and that we need to bring it into focus. So we're going to talk about flow. We're going to introduce you to demand-driven MRP, and then we're going to talk about the 4 innovations of demand-driven MRP. And there's 4 innovations. I also include a 5th one, which is the package of the program, so we can all follow along. and hopefully spend a little bit less time firefighting and a little bit more time managing our business. So what are today's supply chain challenges? Visibility, not a new challenge, but we can't accurately foresee the future. We keep trying to improve forecast accuracy, wrongly thinking that that is the only visibility we need. And we don't really have a way to check the impact of our decisions because our tools are limited. Velocity, the pace of change and disruption is increasing. I don't think anyone believes that change is slowing. We're trying to match the increasingly demanding customer expectations by using a system designed for a world in which we had plenty of time. And variability, expectation versus reality. The ensuing adjustments that we have to make create the chaos. We put a wrong number into a precision system and then constantly adjust it. How's that working for you? The symptoms of our supply chain challenges are many, and I'm sure you've seen many of these before. Expedited freight, overtime, struggles with inventory, constant rescheduling, and one that's often left off is staff morale. Are we ready to concede that doing the wrong things faster isn't working? And let's explore a new direction for a solution. So I want to start off with the end result. There are many companies who have implemented this strategy and this methodology, and Camelot Management Consultants put together a summary of the results. The overall results across all the industries: 13% better service level, 22% reduction in lead time, and about 30% reduction in overall inventory. So you can see this is a huge impact on our business. It sounds too good to be true. I say it's too good to ignore. How is it possible? Well, we're going to talk about that. But let me just ask another question. If you have too much of the wrong stuff and too little of the right stuff, why is cutting inventory our only focus? If there are things that we're short of, we actually need to increase those. Finding which things we're short of is one of the big impacts of DDMRP. So, most of us have lived in a world where cost cutting is our North Star, but we're going to talk about emphasizing flow, because flow is the determinant of success. When flow is occurring, service is consistent and reliable, revenue maximized and protected, inventories are right-sized for your business, expenses, the unnecessary and ancillary, are minimized, and cash flow follows the rate of product flow to market demand. What we understand then is that if we can protect and promote flow, we will maximize our return on investment. So how do we explain flow? Flow is the rate at which a system converts material to product required by a customer. Right? That's an important last part of that phrase there. Producing efficiently product that is not going to be sold is not part of flow. Cash velocity is the rate of net cash generation. And of course, net profit divided by investment is the equation for return on investment. So an improvement in flow improves cash velocity, which improves our return on investment. We can even quantify flow. And if you want to look this up, you can Google something called Little's Law, and you can understand how this came about. But essentially, if we take our throughput times our lead time, we can quantify our WIP. And with mathematics, of course, we can solve for each of the variables. But one of the more important things to understand about flow is that it's a direct contributor to all three of the company vitals. Now, how do we understand company vitals? Imagine you go into an emergency room. They check three things on the human body, right? Respiration, in other words, are you breathing? Blood pressure or pulse rate, how's your heart doing? How's your blood pumping? And your temperature. If any one of those things is out of line or missing expectations, you get to go to the front of the line. Same with your business. You've got contribution margin, working capital, and customer base, and they all need to be in alignment. If one of those starts to ease out towards the edge of that circle, what we call the edge of chaos, then your company is in trouble and you need to react. The interesting thing is, the better things flow, the better controlled costs will be in any particular period. The converse of that is not true. By controlling costs, we are not necessarily improving flow. So if we focus on flow, we will better control our costs. Flow is also the common objective across many of the disciplines that we're using in our businesses today. In MRP, the objective is to synchronize demand and supply, of course, so that we can flow our products through our company and out to the customer. Lean, the objective is to reduce waste. If we remove waste out of the system, we improve flow. Theory of constraints, we improve the system throughput. What's another word for throughput? Submit that it's flow. And in Six Sigma, if we reduce visibility, we improve flow. When things are more consistent, flow is better. So all of these objectives are dependent on flow, which is why we put it at the top of our focus. Also, Plossel's Law, George Plossel, one of the founding fathers of MRP, his law was that all benefits will be directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. So flow has been around a long time, and we have known about it and known of its importance. But we have a challenge to flow, don't we? Have you heard of the VUCA world? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And certainly that explains very well the world we're living in these days. And also certainly, our supply chains look incredibly different from how they looked in 1965 when MRP was coming around. Our customer tolerance times today are short. Product complexity, customization, and variety are all high. We have long lead time parts that we didn't have in 1965. Everybody is under pressure for leaner inventories. And of course, my favorite is transactional friction. That means a couple of things to me. One is, it's really easy now to buy things. With Amazon or almost any website, it's a click or a few clicks to make your purchase, right? And the other side of that is, how did we used to find a new supplier? There was a long process digging through manual books, trying to find a supplier. And today we have 6 letters, Google. And we can have at least a group of potential suppliers in a matter of hours to go to a short list, if you will, to work down to find a new supplier. So it's easier to make your purchases, and it is also easier to find a new supplier. But something is fundamentally broken. We have 2 universal points of inventory. I think we can all agree on this. We have point A, where we have too little, and point B, where we have too much. Now, it stands to reason that somewhere in between point A and point B is a location called just right. So if we look between A and B, we find an optimal range. And next to that optimal range on one side, we have a little warning area. And on the other side, we also have a warning area. So if we can target to have that optimal inventory, and we get a warning when we edge toward too little and a warning when we slide towards too much, we can react before the emergency happens. But what companies face today is something called the bimodal distribution. And what that means is they have a lot of parts where they have too little, they have a lot of parts where they have too much, and they have very few parts that are actually in the optimal range. 90% of companies report this issue, and with every run of MRP, parts move from one extreme to the other. And we end up with three bottom line effects to companies, and our controller looks a lot like this little guy. We have chronic shortages. At the very same time, we have excessive inventory. And we have high expedite expenses and wastes. These are the symptoms, but the real problem is at a bigger level. The real problem is something called the bullwhip effect. Originally was called the Forrester effect, an extreme change in supply position upstream in a supply chain generated by a small change in demand downstream. And we've all seen this, especially recently, we've all seen this played out in grocery stores and convenience stores and all over the country. I'd love to tell you that we figured out a way to remove variability from our world. But the variability that we have in the bullwhip effect, it is the transference and amplification of variability in both directions, right? Our demand signal gets amplified, and then our supply continuity variability gets amplified coming back the other way. The longer the supply chain and the more parts you have, the worse the effect. What can be done about it? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. It leads us right into what is DDMRP. DDMRP is a method to model, plan, and manage supply chains with the idea of protecting and promoting flow of relevant information and materials. We use strategic decoupling points to drive the planning side or supply order generation, which is purchase orders or manufacturing order release, and the supply order management or the execution, which is the rescheduling and the expediting of orders throughout a supply chain. There's a couple of books there on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a few more that have been written, but it was first articulated in 2011 by the Demand Driven Institute. And it's interesting to note that just like MRP, DDMRP was developed by practitioners who were trying to solve a problem, built on the pillars of material requirements planning, distribution requirements planning, lean, theory of constraints, and Six Sigma, along with a whole lot of innovation. And we end up with a mantra of position, protect, and pull. So let's go through the 5 components of DDMRP. The first one is strategic decoupling. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is, where do we place these strategic decoupling points? And when we decide where we're going to place them, essentially, we've placed a firewall in between where that inventory is located, in between each side, whether that's between your company and your supplier, or between a machining cell and an assembly cell. We've put a firewall in between by strategically placing inventory there. Number 2 is buffer profiles and levels. Once we've determined where we're going to place the inventory, we need to understand how much inventory we put there. And number 3 is dynamic adjustments. as the world is changing faster and faster, we need to adapt, and it needs to be dynamic. We may not see and be able to manually adjust everything. So we need to dynamically adjust as we see changes in demand and changes in our usage and changes in our lead time. Number 4 is demand-driven planning. There is a methodology to understand when we need to place orders, right? The planning side of things, when we need to release those orders. And we need to follow the rules of demand-driven planning. And 5 is visible and collaborative execution. Wouldn't it be cool if we could generate a constantly up-to-date version of the priorities and something simple that anyone on the shop floor could understand, and when those priorities changed, they could see that and react accordingly. So let's get into the 4 innovations of DDMRP. Innovation number 1 is decoupled lead time. Traditional MRP only understands 2 types of lead time: manufactured or purchased lead time and cumulative lead time. One of them is too short and one of them is too long. The DDMRP places decoupling points at strategically determined places. We know what decoupling point is. We have had this in the Apex dictionary for years and years. We haven't known how to use it in this way before, so that is one of the innovations. We place our decoupling points at strategically determined places. And what we then get is what we call decoupled lead time. And we create shorter independent lead time horizons. And the decoupled lead time is defined as the longest unprotected sequence in the item's lower level product structure legs. In this example on the screen, you can see that if we have part number SAA, PPX, and PPZ, if we have those inventories, then our time to manufacture, or our lead time for FPB, is 1 + 2 or 3. And we can clearly see that and mathematically understand it. We all know that MRP's version of lead time, the 2 that it understands, are not what we could tell our customer. But DDMRP gives us a methodology to react when a customer says, I need to have at least I need to have a 4-day lead time. Well, if we place inventory in these 3 locations, we have a 3-day lead time. So we've met our customer tolerance time. What do we get from the decoupled lead time? It compresses the lead times to market requirements, like the example I just went through. If we need to have at least a 4-day lead time, well, here's a 3-day lead time. It'll determine more realistic lead times when necessary. And of course, lead time is used in sizing the decoupling points. Therefore, the decoupled lead time is more accurate and allows us to properly size those buffers. And it helps us to find the high value inventory leverage points for additional decoupling. In other words, if part SAA is very expensive, with a 10-day decoupled lead time, we have to hold a lot more inventory in SAA. If we buffered PPA, if we put a strategic decoupling point at PPA, now the lead time, the decoupled lead time for SAA becomes 2 + 3 or 5. So it cuts the lead time in half for SAA, and maybe we can store a little bit less of the expensive part by storing some of the inexpensive part. But you still have to do the math to see if that makes financial sense. Innovation number 2, the net flow equation. 4 questions every planner cares about each day. What is coming to me? What do I have? What demand do I need to fulfill immediately? And what future demand is relevant? So the net flow equation is calculated every day and then compared to the buffer. And the net flow equation is simply what do I have on hand plus what I have on order minus the qualified sales order demand. That gives me my net flow position, which I compare to the buffer. And we can see from the line there, the buffer is clearly in the yellow. If the net flow position compared to the buffer is not in the green zone, then we order from the net flow position up to the top of the buffer. This is the release of either our purchase order or our manufacturing order. Now, you probably have a question, what is qualified demand? Sales order amounts that are past due, due today, or qualified spikes is what constitutes qualified demand. But what is a qualified spike? For a qualified spike, we need to introduce another couple of concepts. Order spike horizon is the length of time in the future in which spikes are considered. So in this case, we're looking forward 7 days, and the line, of course, is our order spike threshold. Anything in daily buckets that exceeds the order spike threshold is included in the net flow equation. So in qualified demand, in this example, we have nothing past due. We have a quantity that is due today, and we have a qualified spike of on day 3. So we include that into our qualified demand. So let's look at an example. Here's our buffer, and we don't, in this webinar, we don't go into the red, yellow, and green concepts of the buffer. Just know that there are 3 separate calculations for the buffer, and each one of them has a reason for being there. And based on that, we know that our buffer is sized properly. So the top of the buffer is 455. We have on hand 105. We have on order 240, and we have a qualified demand of 20. So our net flow equation was on hand plus on order minus the qualified demand, or 325. And we can see 325 is clearly not in the green. It is in the yellow. So we need to place an order from the net flow position up to the top of the buffer. So we place an order for 130. Innovation number 3 is a decoupled explosion. From the Apex Dictionary, we know what the requirements explosion is. The process of calculating demand for components based on the bill of materials for the parent. Right? We have an end item demand, and when that demand changes, it explodes down through the bill of materials. In other words, when anything changes in the end item demand, everything changes. The decoupled explosion starts the same, right? We have an end item demand. When there is a change, we explode, but we stop at each stock position. So we explode through to the next stock position no matter what. Now on the strategic buffers, when we enter the rebuild zone, which means, like we just saw in the example, when we break out of the green, our net flow compared to the buffer puts us into the yellow or the red. That's what triggers the explosion to restart and continue. So you can see any change in the end item demand, in this case, only affects 2 other parts. We don't have complete chaos by having every single other part in the bill of materials affected. Decoupled explosion literally means independent dependence. However, in between the decoupling points, MRP is still there. DDMRP explodes in the exact same manner as MRP. DDMRP still seeks to net to zero between the decoupling points. And you can see highlighted in the blue box, for those parts or that part of the product structure, MRP is still happening. Don't throw out what you know. Innovation number 4 is relative priority. And this is another piece where we separate out the planning and the execution. So for both planning and execution, DDMRP focuses on priority by buffer status, as opposed to what we use today in traditional MRP, priority by due date. Well, let's talk about the difference. If we have priority by due date, often we have the same due dates, right? 2 items due on May 12th. Assuming they take more than a few hours to complete and you can't do them on the same day, how do you choose which one of those 2 you would do first? But we certainly know that the 2 due on May 12th are the most important. However, if we look at priority by buffer status, we can see clearly, comparing our on-hand balance to the buffer, we see that we're 12% in the red and 27% in the red. In other words, 12% of my buffer remains. And for the second part, 27% of my buffer remains. Both of them in the red zone, both of them critically important. But oh my gosh, the due date for the one that looks to be in the worst shape is May 14th. When we look by due date, that would have been our 3rd priority. But in reality, that should be our 1st priority. And it is clearly understandable to everybody which one is most vital. And if we look at the 2 manufacturing orders due on May 12th, we can also clearly see that one of them is much more important than the other. Again, with planning and execution, relative priority tells us a couple of things. One is how critical the part's position is relative to its own buffer level. In other words, for item 406P, we have 20% of our buffer remaining. We need to move quickly. It also shows us in comparison to our other strategic items. So 406P is more vital than 403P, which is more vital than 402P, to act on releasing the purchase order, right? The separation between planning and execution, planning priority tells us when we release the purchase order. And if we follow this example through, we've got 6 purchase parts and 5 of them that we need to order. Imagine if all of these parts came from the same supplier. You could give them this report every day and they would understand what things are probably coming down the pipe next. And they can be prepared. If they're running all these parts on the same machine, if you release these orders today, the 5 orders that need to be released, if you release them today, there's a chance you're going to put them all due on the same day. How in the world is your supplier going to know which one you need most or fastest? Giving them this report says, even though they're due on the same day, 406P is the most vital, and then 403P. Essentially scheduling that machine, assuming that they're all produced on the same machine. Now, if we look to the right-hand side of the screen, we can see an on-hand status. And the on-hand status is part of the execution view, right? Releasing of the orders for your business is creating the purchase order or creating the manufacturing order. Once you've created those, now we can go over and look at the on-hand status and say, what's the priority for producing, for example, or for scheduling a manufacturing cell? If these 4 manufacturing orders are produced in the same manufacturing cell, we can clearly see that manufacturing order 12401 should be done next, even though the due date is 2 days after a couple of the other parts. Now, don't forget what you know. Even having this information, 12%, 27, 53, and 61%, even having that information, if you have changeover times, color sequences, allergen sequences, if you have reasons for producing your parts in a certain order, don't forget what you know. But having this information tells you if, for example, the one that is at 12% should be done last in your sequence, well, maybe today you should switch that sequence up. But you have now the information to be able to make that decision intelligently. So we have critical differences between MRP and DDMRP. With MRP, there's no decoupling. Everything is dependent, forces a longer planning horizon, and variability accumulation. With DDMRP, the strategically determined decoupling points compress lead times and absorb the bidirectional variability from the bullwhip effect. MRP is not designed to manage stock positions, right? It's designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator, and it nets to 0. DDMRP never nets to 0 for the strategic decoupling points. It was designed specifically to manage those strategic stock positions. Most conventional safety stock and reorder point positions are static. We set it and forget it. And another thing about safety stock, to me, I look at safety stock as the new 0. Think about your MRP system. What's the difference in your MRP system reaction to when your balance hits the safety stock or your balance hits 0? That's right, there's no difference. It reacts exactly the same. So if you think adding safety stock for a part is going to help you, the actual reaction is that the next day you will get an increase in order and an increase in urgency in your MRP system, even though you know full well that you have the parts on hand. All you did was increase the safety stock. But now you have messages coming out of your MRP that tell you you need to work on this right now, drop everything else and work on this. And you know that's not true, so you ignore that. And then MRP daily gets more and more frustrated with you, telling you it's more important and more important. DDMRP, the stock buffers are dynamically adjusted based on the consumption and future known events. And it doesn't work like safety stock in any way. MRP attempts to keep the full safety at all costs, so we end up with unnecessary expedites and dead inventory. DDMRP assumes that the safety will be used frequently. It is actually deemed normal. Why would you hold inventory if you never intend to use it? With MRP, using a forecasted demand signal guarantees constant nervousness and expedites. And with DDMRP, supply order generation is tied directly to actual demand. We have no master production schedule and we have no planned orders. We solely, for the strategically decoupled points, supply order generation is based on the net flow position compared to the buffer. And with MRP, we follow priority by due date. With DDMRP, priority by buffer status. And you've seen in the most recent examples why that matters. The other thing that I'll say about that due date, right? We talked about the explosions and the decoupled explosions. When MRP, traditional MRP, there are two things that can change, right? Your end item demand can change, We've had an order for 10, they want to switch it to 12. We have to change the quantity. And that causes chaos throughout the whole structure of that product. But a customer might also call and say, I know I said I need it 2 weeks from now, but now I need it 1 week from now. When I change that date, I also change everything else in the bill of materials in that product structure. So traditional MRP, some of the things that we keep doing, we're inflicting that pain on ourselves, but it's not our fault because these are the tools that we've had. What we're suggesting with demand-driven MRP is that the tool set changes, and now we can do some things that we were not able to do before. So if you look at the chart, the graph, you can see it looks a lot like a statistical process control chart, right? And if I can look at history of my individual part on-hand balance, right? The green zone is where I expect to be. The yellow zone is a little bit of a warning, and the red zone is a much stronger warning. I can see clearly that this part has been managed quite well, and I don't need to react to this. Imagine, though, if it showed that I was constantly hitting the lower red. Well, then immediately I have an obvious move to make. I have to go fix this part. And now with this kind of a graph, I can see my continuous improvement projects simply by looking at my history. I don't have to try and guess what it is, and I don't have to wait for the emergency to happen before I react. So we can say goodbye to the bimodal distribution and say hello sunshine, because DDMRP is proven to allow companies to plan and execute in the optimal range at strategically chosen points. And what we gain is that flow is protected. So what are the next steps? We start with 2 days of education. The demand-driven planner class gives all the secret sauce and lets your people understand and ask questions about this methodology. The interesting thing about how we've been traditionally working with MRP, right? In the traditional world, you buy the MRP system, then you implement, and then you realize you need education. What we're suggesting is you start with the education. Let's understand how the system works, how the methodology works. And then you can pilot it, which is step number 2 here. You don't need to replace your back-end systems, but you need a data review and a way to pilot the system. We know that it works for everyone, but because it's a methodology and not a recipe, it may work differently for you. There may be parts of the methodology that are more important or less important when you compare your company to the company next door to you. We simply take advantage of the cloud and build up a sustainable planning process based on a methodology that is designed to handle change. And change is the one thing that we know is constantly happening. Thank you for your time and attention today, and I believe I'll turn it back to Bill to help us out with the questions.
Awesome, John. Thank you very much for sharing this great information in the session today. Now I'm going to just open up the floor to take a few questions. Just a reminder to anyone who would like to continue submitting questions, please be sure to submit them through the Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar console. So we've had a few questions come in over the course of the presentation. Some of them may have come a little bit early in the presentation, so you may have covered the topics, but I'm gonna go through them anyway, John, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
First question would be, how effective is DDMRP at controlling inventory sourced from long lead time overseas suppliers. Now, I have to apologize to the person who submitted that. It was very brief, so we had to sort of go through it and try to refocus the question. If that's not the correct question, please feel free to submit it to the email. But I believe that's the way the question was intended to be.
So the long lead time parts function in the same way, right? If you remember the slide that showed the buffer, the red, yellow, green zones, those zones would be larger because the lead time is longer. But it's sized with the same information. And then, I always tell people, don't forget what you know. You understand how that part works. What are the things we need to know? Lead time, our average daily usage, and some form of variability factor. And then there's a lead time factor that's calculated in the system as well, or that's created through the system. So we put those things together, and that sizes the buffer. Now, you have things like, I'll just quickly go through this. The green zone is about your order size and frequency. Right? Your yellow zone is the cycle stock, or covering the demand during lead time. And the red zone is the safety embedded in the buffer. So think about the green zone. Green zone has to do with order size and frequency. The longer the lead time, the more frequent, smaller orders you want to come in, right? You don't want to put it all on one boat and risk having a problem with that order. And maybe for cash flow, you also don't want to have a huge order come in and you got to make one big payment instead of a bunch of small payments. So your green zone size is adjusted according to what you know, right? The interesting thing about demand driven is we put our work into the back end of the system, into the logic, and then we can just follow the results. In MRP, how many people, I have not met anyone who takes the report out of MRP and follows it to the letter, right? We dump it into a spreadsheet and we try and outsmart ourselves, trying to figure out what we really should do. With DDMRP, we put our work into the back end and we say, we have a minimum order quantity of 3,000, therefore that's about how much we're going to order, and that's results in a certain thing. But the cool part is, like from that last slide, when you look at the history of that particular part, you can see, oh boy, because I have an MOQ, I always have way more inventory than I need. Or because I've set another parameter, I'm running out of that part more often. And I know I have to go fix about 5 things. And I know what those 5 things are that I need to go look at. With MRP, I'm taking a shot in the dark usually to try and fix it. And I don't have a historical view, so I don't really have a way to say, did what I just implement, did that work? I don't have a quick way to see that. And I hope that answered the question. It probably went way deeper than you wanted to hear.
It was a good answer. It was a good reply, John. I got a couple of really high-level questions here that I'm going to throw at you. They are pretty high level, so you may need to sort of keep them to very summary responses that you probably see in your sort of Apex classes and teaching. But in this particular one, how does supply chain play a vital role in the economy?
Well, that's an interesting question, considering the world that we're in right now. Supply chain is, I guess I look at it as supply chain is everything. And everything, there's nothing, when I look around me, whether I'm in my house or at work or wherever I am, when I look around me, supply chain is everything. There's nothing I can see that didn't get here through supply chain, except maybe if I'm outdoors, the air that I'm breathing and the sunshine not coming through a supply chain. But, everything else is coming through a supply chain. And if you think, I think about examples all the time. You go to an airport and there's a supply chain going on there, right? We're moving people from place to place. And the airplanes have to come in on time. The staff has to be where they're supposed to be. the people who are supposed to fly the plane are supposed to be where they're supposed to be. This coordination of all of these things is really the way supply chain thinking works. I always like to say to people, if you own a refrigerator at home, you are a supply chain manager. It's just that some of us are supply chain managers where we have 1,000 refrigerators and we can only see into one of them. And imagine the complexity that that brings. But without supply chains, without, you can see today, without trucks bringing the food from the farmers, the food goes to waste. If we don't have medical supplies, people are in danger. If we don't have, I don't know why, but if we don't have toilet paper, people get cranky. And so there's just a lot of things that all have to come together in this world. And supply chain really is what makes that happen.
And I think to summarize that just a little bit is the transformation of materials into finished products that we all use in our daily life, which obviously supports the idea that jobs are created from that, right? And that income and revenue that's created feeds back into the economy, and that's what sustaining the economy is all about. Next question here is, how can a company be more agile without investing in inventory? And I think that sort of really speaks to the purpose of the DDMRP thinking, right? And where that came from is that evolution in supply chain thinking. But I'll let you respond to that.
Right. So the interesting thing about what we find, the world we find ourselves in, is that most of us in companies have been given a directive to say, you need to reduce inventory. And the actual thing is, we need to have the right amounts of the right inventory when we need them. And DDMRP gives you the tools to better estimate approximately what you need, right? It's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. If we roughly need about 20, well, if I've got 19, I'm probably in some trouble. And so I need to be able to react to that. So without any inventory, I don't know how you could be very agile. But just because you have lots of inventory doesn't mean you'll have the right inventory. So the key to me is having the right inventory when you need it. And that comes down to collaboration and communication and understanding. But we know the forecast is not going to be exactly correct. So we need to have a number or a range of numbers that we use in place of a forecast that can be roughly right instead of precisely wrong.
Yeah, and it really speaks to sort of the industry itself. Supply chain management is becoming a bigger topic in most companies. It's becoming a lot more focused. There's a lot more consultants who run their business around supply chain planning initiatives. We know that the supply chain evolution has been taking place over a long period of time, and so companies are more focused on looking for opportunities to become more agile without investing their inventory, and that's just a function, I think, of being supply chain focused and following some of these strategies like John's presented today. Couple questions I'm going to combine here together because I think you touched on them in one slide there. What is the difference between theory of constraints and DDMRP, and what is the difference between Kanban-based replenishment and DDMRP? Sorry.
So it's an interesting thing because theory of constraints, Lean, Six Sigma are all part of demand-driven MRP. It's time we got past this idea that we have to marry to one of the methodologies, right? I love Kanban. I implemented a lot of Kanban in my life, but where Kanban fails is when I have a spike that the Kanban can't handle. Well, DDMRP looks like a Kanban system, but we're also looking for spikes. So it takes that Kanban and improves it. Now, if you have a part that that is not transacted well in your system, or that is used in different quantities every time you use it, so the bill of materials isn't accurate, then Kanban is your choice. So theory of constraints, same thing. None of these are wrong, and they all have a place. So don't throw out lean, don't throw out theory of constraints, but where lean struggles, DDMRP picks up. Where theory of constraints or Six Sigma struggles, DDMRP picks up. And DDMRP uses some of the tools from each of those methodologies. So they all work together. There is not something where you'd say really there's a difference. It's a combination of all of them put into one piece.
Very good. Okay, cool. We are getting close to 3 minutes to the end, so I wanted to move through a couple slides here. What's the, sorry, questions, not slides. What's the difference between buffer management and multi-echelon inventory optimization? And DDMRP buffer management, and I think some of this was covered through your innovation slides, and to my thinking, the key difference in the question is really a discussion between distribution management versus manufacturing bill of material levels. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you know, we just went through the innovations. When you go through the 2-day class, we talk a lot more about distribution and how it might apply into a distribution scenario. But I think the main way that I would answer that question is you need to understand the different methodologies, and you need to understand your business, and then you can put those things into place or into play where they make the most sense for you. Right? I've drank all the Kool-Aid, so I believe DDMRP is the answer. And so I start with that. But where DDMRP isn't the answer, then we fall back and we find out what are our other choices and what could really work here. But you could start the other way and say, if my Kanban is failing me, or my distribution center is constantly running out of parts, well, maybe it's time to look in another direction. And maybe what you'll end up with is kind of a hybrid of using DDMRP in with some of the other tools you use, because there is no one answer to any of these questions.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, John. I'm just going to have to, we got a lot more questions to go through, lots of great questions from our attendees. So we'll have to take some time to go through that after the webinar. We're right at the 12:30 mark. So just to respond to some of those questions, we'll review them with you, and then we have the contacts, name and email addresses. We can send responses out to everybody, as well as the contacts. So just to wrap up, great conversation today. Thanks everyone for attending our webinar. John, thank you very much for your presentation. If anyone is interested in learning more about DDMRP to support your supply chain initiatives, please feel free to contact us at the following website, email address, and phone number. And if anyone is interested in speaking with John directly, you can find him on his LinkedIn profile, but we can also find him through the SHEA organization as well. Also, please visit our website for more information on future events at SHEA, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time, and thank you, John. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.